Hi, Misha here, and last time we looked at the Australian Air Force Canberra, the B-20 or Mark 20, and this is of course a 1/72 scale diecast from Corgi, and talked about if got a decent number of views we would keep on. So this time, even though it's not a new model, in fact it was the second release ever in the series, let's check out the U.S. Air Force Martin B-57. Yeah, the American licensed Canberra, kind of unique. In fact, it was really the only foreign design of the jet era in U.S. service. Now this is the RB-57A, the reconnaissance variant. There's also, of course, the B-57B, and many others, including the quite interesting G variant, which was a night interdictor used in 69-70 Vietnam. This is also, of course, 1/72 scale diecast from Corgi with the same features, gear up and down, just a much older release. So we'll go over the history of this and talk about why and how America ended up not just using, but even licensed producing a foreign jet design. In fact, this was the first jet bomber in U.S. Air Force service and the first jet tactical bomber to ever drop ordnance and anger in a combat zone, combat theater. Although, while it was originally adopted and put into production for the Korean War, like a lot of things, it came literally about a month or two late to see any combat there, but would see pretty extensive use throughout Vietnam for nearly a decade. And the U.S. Martin would actually produce quite a few of these, over 400 in several variations, and use them for about 3 decades. So yeah, let's kind of dive in and go to the before times, before the Korean War, U.S. 1950. The Korean War kicks off mid-1950, and the U.S. Air Force realizes it doesn't really have a medium tactical bomber, interdictor. So, yeah, it's kind of looking around. Now, keep in mind, at this point, while there were some fighter and fighter bomber jets, like the F-80, F-84, and F-86 coming into service, there was not really a jet bomber as such in the U.S. Air Force. In fact, the Canberra was one of the very first in the world anywhere. And that pretty much explains why on August 17, the U.S. Air Force arranged a demonstration over in England of the English Electric B-2 Canberra. Now, this was soon after the Australians had selected it, but still before it had gone into service with either England or Australia. So this is pretty much a pre-production model they check out. And they were pretty suitably impressed. In fact, several trips were made to the English Electric factory. Pilots, engineers checked it out, kind of saw what was going on. And this would lead, just a month later, September 16, the Air Force released some requirements for a new medium jet bomber with a secondary role capability of photo reconnaissance. They required it at least hit a speed of 630 miles per hour, have a range of over 1,100 miles at least, an altitude of at least 40,000 feet, and there were other specifications for payload and such and such. Yeah, the Canberra was already a favorite, but there were other designs considered as well. And this was interesting because, one, the designs kind of needed to be already developed or in advanced development, and they did allow foreign designs. In fact, the English Electric Canberra wasn't the only one. The Canadian Avro CF100 was also considered. And domestically, we have the North American B-45, the Tornado. We have one I've never even heard of, the AJ Savage. And maybe more importantly, we have the Martin RB-51. So there were a total of 5 designs considered in late 1950, but the U.S. Congress mandated that there be a fly-off, some testing. So that's what we would roll into in 1951. Meanwhile, of course, the Korean War is carrying on and on and on. From this point, things move at a brisk pace because, well, there's an immediate and urgent need. So a fly-off between the designs was set up at Andrews Field to begin in late February of 1951, kind of wrapping up in March. And to this end, the British sent over an early B-2 on February 23rd for testing. And already by the 26th, they started flying it. And it was already a favorite. They already kind of based the requirements of this around the Canberra. Then again, there weren't a ton of jet bombers of this size and class in the world anyway, so it kind of makes sense. And leading into March, it was becoming the clear favorite. It's a good thing they didn't go with the Avro CF-100, and I don't even know what the AJ Savage was, so But there was political opposition, and of course Martin had its own design. But then, a solution was pretty immediately hit upon, and that's why we have the Martin B-57 here. English Electric was already busy making the Canberra. Soon they would make the Lightning, which is one of my favorite designs of all time because it's cool. And they just had other government contracts, so they really didn't have time to make a few hundred airplanes for the U.S. Air Force. And Martin's own XB-51 had its own teething issues. So by early to mid-March, there were talks about, hey, Martin just producing under license a version for the Air Force in America. The British will get something out of it. Martin will get something out of it. The Air Force will get a plane as quick as possible. Things were looking good. This also would mollify some of the not made here guys in the political arena in Congress. I mean, yeah, it's a foreign design, but it's the British, and they're doing pretty well with jet engines. They had kind of spearheaded things with the Meteor, which this kind of reminds me of a large version of, to be honest. And so on March 23, 1951, the U.S. Air Force places an order for 250 of the new aircraft, even before an agreement is inked. But an agreement is very quick in coming. By April 3rd, English Electric and the Glenn L. Martin Company formally signed a license production agreement. So they knew it was coming. And at this point, there's a couple of names and designations given to this good old jet. Martin, their internal company name, is Model 272. And the Air Force will designate it as the B-57A, the initial production version at any rate, or the RB-57A for the photo reconnaissance version, which this actually is a model here from Corgi. And yeah, it is very, very similar to the Australian one we've seen, and the original British versions as well, like the B2 and RB3. Although there were some American changes, including one change that would actually be kind of detrimental. But more or less, the size and performance in the beginning was the same, and they needed these out as quick as possible. Therefore, in August of that year, a second B-2 was sent over for a pattern aircraft training familiarization. So 2 British-made examples were in America. There was a small bump in the road when one of them was lost to an accident right before Christmas of that year, which did kind of toss up some political controversy again, but it was pretty quickly determined that it was more of an error made by the ground crew on refueling and resupply. And so this would lead to some changes in the design for the production, but also just changes in procedure. Again, jet bombers, very new concept, so no shade there at all, guys, no shade. But by 1952, things are on track, and we do see some of the changes, including some featured in this Corgi model, so good on Corgi. 1952 was pretty much spent testing the couple of planes available. And the Wright Air Development Center, the WATC, did suggest several changes to the design, but these were foregone, at least in the first production batch, to get the initial version designated as the B-57A out as quick as possible. And so Martin was setting up the line, and the only changes that really crept in of note were these fuel tanks on the wingtips. And one thing the Americans hated from the get-go was the 3-seat cockpit crew layout with the jump seat there. The Australians didn't like it either, so they reduced the crew to 2, pilot and navigator, getting rid of the 3rd seat altogether. But the most important and major change, the engines. The British, of course, had the Rolls-Royce Avon. We talked about that in the Australian video. And whereas Australia just made the Avon under license and country, the Americans would go a different direction, and that's actually exemplified in this model. The Americans preferred the Armstrong Siddeley Sapphire engine because they thought it would give a higher weight and better performance in hot weather, humid, kind of tropical environments. And you can see that in the engines here. They do look different on this model, especially the cones. And these would be made in the U.S. under license by Wright as the J65. Although that's a little bit of a lie, because what Wright would do, they would subcontract the engines out to a different company. The J65 would be made under license and subcontract by Buick, and then Wright would get them and test them, and then they would go to Martin for use in the aircraft. To that end, it took a little while to set things up and get things right. There were a few other small changes made, but essentially the B-57A was the same as a British B-2. Anyway, the first American-produced aircraft was finished in early July of 1953 and would take to the skies at the end of that month. And the U.S. Air Force would officially take delivery and acceptance of it in August. Just one problem. The Korean War was over, or at least there was a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire. And that actually explains why this is not a B-57A tactical bomber, but rather an RB-57A photo reconnaissance bird. As I said earlier, the Air Force ordered 250 jets from Martin, but the first batch was to be 75. But only the first 8 would be made as bombers. The remaining 67 would be RB-57As, just because of changing needs. Also, the A version in the bomber role was never felt to be combat capable. They were safe enough. They just, they'd be used for other purposes, but they were used for training, evaluation. They just didn't have what the Air Force was looking for. Spec-wise, this is very similar to the Aussie we looked at before, and the British ones we'll look at in the next video. It's about 65.5 feet long, 64-foot wingspan. It's actually slightly slower because of the different engines. At about 600 miles per hour max speed, cruise a little under 500 miles per hour. It has a slightly lower maximum altitude of about 45,000 feet. Again, it depends on the exact version, variant, and model configuration, so it's hard to say. It also has a slightly lower bomb load or payload load of about 7,500 pounds entirely, including in the bomb bay and under the wings, although this version didn't typically have wing pylons except for the fuel tanks, which are, kind of permanent or semi-permanent. So, yeah, you see that in these engines. Goods and bads. And we'd see more changes with internal fuel tankage as the plane would lead on. But yeah, by the end of 1953, the U.S. Air Force had its first medium jet bomber, tactical bomber, and photo reconnaissance variation, which this is here. Corgi has made a couple of these. One from America and one in kind of West German guise as these were stationed. Instead of the bomb bay, you've got gear inside there. They would also do a electronic warfare variation as well. This makes me super nervous putting it on the stand and spinning it. I do my best. Anyway, this exact version, the RB-57A, the reconnaissance version, first flew October 1953 and was soon put into squadron service. Again, the 8 bomber variants were never used anywhere actively. They were just training and evaluation, but the 67 some odd reconnaissance ones were. In fact, by July of 1954, they were being stationed not just in America, but overseas, including West Germany, which is again the one Corgi did, also France, and Japan. So, yeah. But they quickly had some issues. Again, the WAT knew that changes needed to be made to better suit the Air Force, but they wanted to get this into production because no one knew how long the Korean War would last, and photo reconnaissance jets were actually very useful in wartime for searching out targets and seeing what bomb damage was after raids. I mean, do we need to send another raid in, or do we hit our targets? So it makes perfect sense. But in 54, that need's over. Of course, the Cold War is doing its thing. And what they were seeing was there was a inordinately high accident rate, which could be partially put down to training. But there was also a pretty low availability rate. And there were issues with the engines and smoke getting into the canopy from the engines. It's those J65s that switch over to the Armstrong engine design. And it wasn't directly Wright's fault because it was more on Buick. For one, they were behind on their production quotas, and their QC and testing just wasn't up to snuff. And therefore, sometime in 54, Wright just had to take over direct manufacturing and testing of the engines from Buick. And then things would improve by 1955 as they worked out the kinks, but still it kind of gave the aircraft a reputation, which is a little unfortunate for it and for Martin. But this was the first generation. Keep in mind, they weren't really doing true prototypes at this point, the way the Air Force was mostly requesting aircraft. If you see my earlier ones looking at, the F-102, for example, they were pretty much just doing initial production batches and seeing how it worked out, kind of working it out as along the way. And that's what we saw here with the RB-57A. They were flown when available, but already by 1957, they were starting to get phased out for newer reconnaissance aircraft, and by 58, they were really out of active U.S. Air Force service. However, the reserves, the Air National Guard, would continue flying these domestically until 1971. So they saw nearly 2 decades of use, because most of them were built in 53, 54. I think by 55 they'd already kind of moved on to newer models, but they were stationed overseas. And the fact that this was really the only foreign jet design that the U.S. Air Force really entertained, I think says quite a bit. And it was, again, their first tactical jet. In the reconnaissance role, it was considered a medium altitude, medium range. And at the beginning, a speed of 600 miles per hour was pretty good, but of course we're getting to the F-100 Super Sabre, and we're crossing that threshold into supersonic, so aircraft technology is just moving along at a very rapid pace. And to that end, Martin would not give up on the design, nor the Air Force. So we have lots of variations, and including we have a lot of use in Vietnam. But since this model is not really of those patterns, we're just going to do kind of a lightning round as best I can. Yeah, me trying to be quick. We'll see how it goes. With peacetime, it gave Martin and the U.S. Air Force time to reevaluate and really change the design to suit their needs. For one thing, they never liked that it didn't have guns. The British didn't arm it up because they were kind of being inspired by the World War II Mosquito, which used pretty much speed and altitude to defend itself. But no, the Americans wanted guns. And they would add 8, so 4 on each wing, 50 calibers early on, and then soon after roughly 90 aircraft switch over to 4 20mm cannon, 2 per wing, for the rest of the build duration. They would also change up that cockpit. Originally in Britain, it started off as a side-by-side seater, again, kind of inspired by the Mosquito, and then the weird 3 thing with the seat on the navigator behind the pilot squeezed in. Well, they would switch that up to what they called a fighter cockpit style with tandem seating. They would also delete the door on the starboard side, getting in and out, and they would delete the bomber, the plexiglass bomber nose, that whole thing. So they would really rework the interior quite a bit. And they would, of course, add a gun sight because they added guns. They would also go to a new bomb bay, actually inspired by Martin's own RB-51, which was a rotating door bay. This did decrease the bomb carriage a bit, but it had a couple of upsides. It allowed for more fuel inside the aircraft. It also allowed for higher speeds because with the Australian and British B-2s, to open up the clamshell style doors, you had to slow down quite a bit because of drag and just all that. But with the rotating door, you could just kind of drop and go at nearly regular speed. So that was good. They also reworked the air brakes, they strengthened the structure, yada, yada, yada. This became the B-57B. And it first flew on June 18, 1954. And actually, the later British versions, like the B-8 and RB-9, would adopt many of the changes, namely the cockpit layout for the most part. So they had some good ideas here with this next generation. However, in the summer of 54, they still had troubles with the engines, also with the tail. Some planes were lost in accidents when they would essentially nosedive into the ground uncontrollably, so that required reworking of the tail a bit. Remember from the Australian video, we talked about initially the vertical was wood. It was about the only wood part on the aircraft, but yeah. So they had to kind of fix that up. So it took the B-57B a little while to go into service, but it did start going into the squadrons later that year. Since the B-57A was never a bomber capable, this would be the first tactical bomber version to go into actual deployment. And they would ultimately build 177 B-57Bs in that first production batch. They wanted to build up to 250, but the initial allocation, the initial budget ran out, so, that's kind of what they got. However, after the kinks were worked out, it was well enough liked, and the Air Force was able to lobby for budget that they were able to place a second order at the end of 1954 for 100 more B-57B medium bombers, plus 38 B-57C dual-control trainers, and 20 RB-57D high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, or at least higher than the 57A. So that was the second major order, not bad for 158 aircraft in total. And the next year, the third and final production order would come for 68 B-57E target towing versions, essentially pretty much the same as everything else. And it would take Martin through 1957 to deliver all these ordered. And then they would have the production lines shut down by 1958. So relatively short run, 52 to 58, considering setting up. However, they did turn out a total of 403 Canberras in America, so 10 times more, nearly 9 times for sure more than what Australia did, and nearly half as many as was made in the UK, which is a little over 900. And they did advance the design forward, so you had the A's, the B's, the C's, the D's, and the E's in the initial production run. And while the bomber roles in the standard Air Force were pretty limited, they already started getting phased out by like the F-100 Super Sabre in 1958, 1959. Again, supersonic jets were just kind of coming into vogue. They would actually have much more of a future than you might initially think, including quite the storied history in Vietnam, both the bombing version and the photo reconnaissance version, and a new variation, electronic warfare and countermeasures version, which appeared in 1959. So even though new airframes are no longer being made, boy howdy did they kind of rework and revamp and restyle the ones they had. Starting in 1959, since the original RB-57As were kind of being pulled out of frontline service and just in the Air Guard, and they were surplus to needs, Martin started modifying them into the EB-57A, which was an electronic warfare aircraft, and these were used first by the Air Force itself and then later the Air National Guard for training aggressor aircraft, just modern electronic warfare type things. And actually, some would stay in the Air Guard service until 1983. And they were pretty much just modified, taking some of the cameras out and putting the electronic gear and stuff in the bomb bay and the nose. And kind of interesting. But that's pretty much it for the standard original photo reconnaissance versions. But remember those RB-57Ds that were made, the updated 20? Those were flown by Strategic Air Command, SAC, beginning in 1956, and were used on a lot of clandestine missions, special operations, and started to be phased out in the early 60s by the U-2 and newer spy aircraft, and were taken out of active frontline service in 1964. Again, they only had 20. But the reason is they were kind of pushing the envelope forward. And remember those target towing B-57Es? Well, they would end up having a much more interesting career in a modified form, because the first two were sent over to Southeast Asia to operate in and around Vietnam on April 15, 1963, beginning the American Canberra's involvement in what would soon become the Vietnam War. Known as Patricia Lynn missions, these clandestine reconnaissance operations would start right after the aircraft were sent. Like I said, they got there in April. By May 7, the pilots were already flying first nighttime, then daytime and nighttime missions to detect Viet Cong and other enemy installations, sites, buildings, as well as later on assess damage from raids and such. And they proved to be much more effective than the RF-101 Voodoos. They could fly higher, and they could take bigger, better pictures. They had more room for equipment. But these were new versions known as RB-57E. And they were actually not made by Martin. They were created by General Dynamics. That's because they had already had earlier success with the RB-57F project. And the F is really almost a whole new Canberra. It has a huge wing. It was mainly made for extremely high altitude surveillance, like weather monitoring and surveillance of nuclear testing, sampling. In fact, a lot of them were designated as weather aircraft later on, and 3 are even being flown by NASA into the 21st century. But I digress. 21 RB-57Fs were created, and General Dynamics started with regular Canberras from Martin, Most were from earlier B-57Bs, but some were converted from the 57D, and even 3 later on, 1967, were converted from RB-57As like this one, so some were turned into the Fs. And this model, while it had its role and purpose, and while a few were stationed overseas like in Japan and Germany, it really wasn't well suited to Southeast Asia. It had its own issues because of that huge wing. They did send a couple over in 1965, but they didn't do well, and they were quickly removed from theater. So it was the right call in 1963 to make a new variation just for Southeast Asia, and that would be the RB-57E. Martin would convert a number of just the B-57Es, starting with 2, by installing a couple of cameras in the nose and cameras and early IR equipment, infrared, in the bomb bay. And these missions proved very successful very early on for what they were. It was a very desperately needed asset in the second half of 1963 and moving into 1964, so much so that they would continue to fly the missions all the way up through 1971, and even create a few more RB-57E conversions. And I do think it's neat, that these two operated together, and this would not be the only version and variant in Vietnam, far from it. The Patricia Lynn missions were so successful that in 1964, 3 more RB-57E conversions were authorized and conducted by General Dynamics, and in August of that year, the first B-57Bs were sent to Southeast Asia, so kind of similar to this Australian version. So you had the bomber and the reconnaissance, but the bombers had a rocky start, accidents and things, so they wouldn't start operations until February of 1965, and they wouldn't start operating in and over North Vietnam until March of 1965 in Operation Rolling Thunder, and would do some bombing. They would usually carry 9 500-pound bombs in the bay, plus 4 750-pound bombs under the wings, whereas this Australian only has 1 hardpoint per wing. The American version would have 2. And also, the American version would have the guns. Like I said, the early production Bs would have the 50 cal machine guns, but then the later ones would have 20 mil cannons. And this actually started quite an activity known as truck hunting or truck plinking on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And that would actually end up with the Centurion Club, where if you had destroyed at least 100 trucks, you were, special, and people bought you drinks. So they became quite infamous. The bombing version is nighttime interdictors. Ironically, one of the roles they originally were envisioned for in 1950 and whatnot, but it took until 1965, 66 to kind of see that. But the reconnaissance versions here were definitely still operating. The bombers and the recon versions would operate together in Operation Steel Tiger, which not only operated over North Vietnam and the DMZ and all that, but also Laos, and would eventually lead to some operations in Cambodia, which would have some political ramifications for those nations as well, Southeast Asia folks. But there would be some losses. The first RB-57E was lost in August of 1965, although the crew did safely eject. Lucky for them, the American Martin version did have updated ejection seats compared to the original B-2 from Britain. And there would be a 6th E authorized, and it would go into service in 1968 with some new equipment, including train-following radar. I should mention that all the E's had their electronics, especially like the infrared equipment, the night equipment, updated on a pretty regular basis, so they were always constantly in flux. And with a fleet of 4 or 5 operating at any time, they could do that. They would also have a second loss in October of 1968, and again the crew would eject. So 6 were made, 4 were lost in combat. It's what it is. They flew a lot of missions, did a lot of work, and again, they worked alongside the American B-57B, which while the active Air Force really wasn't using anymore, the Air National Guard sure was. In the past, Corgi did a British B-8 Mark 8, which had the so-called fighter-style canopy, but only one, I think, maybe two. They've never done a B-57B, but since they've got that B-8, I really hope now that they brought the Australian Mark 20, maybe they'll give us some variation in the later style for the American. I'd like to see that, especially in Vietnam, guys, to kind of go along with this one. Because, yeah, the whole group started operating together in 1967 and would do so for several years. 94 B-57Bs would be sent to Vietnam over the years. And they would see heavy use and were reasonably effective at day and night operations. However, they had a heavy toll. For one, planes are just wearing out. These were not brand new airframes. All of them were at least a decade old, some of them 15 years. And so, yeah, it's parts wear and breakage. Keep in mind their availability was never fantastic to begin with. But they would also lose 51 to enemy action one way or another, plus at least another 7 to accidents. So 58 are the official loss numbers for the American Canberra, rather, in Vietnam. So by 1969, only 9 were operational in theater of the bomber variant. So that's not good. Can't really do a whole lot with that. And that would kind of lead to the last gasp version, and known as the B-57G. The B-57G was the last major variant of note, although there had been plans for more. Not bad for the American Canberra. I mean, here we are well over a decade after production ended. Back when the Centurion Club was being made and the truck destroying thing on the Ho Chi Minh Trail and everything in night operations, night interdiction, the guns proved really useful and, kind of low-level strafing, even dive bombing. So they took 16 B-57Bs that had been stateside, so hadn't seen the rigors of Southeast Asia, and they modified them into Gs. These are meant to be night interdictors. We've seen other aircraft in this on this channel that do this for there, and they gave it the newest technology they could for night operations. They had a whole new nose with a forward-looking radar. It had the newest IR. It had a low-light television camera system, and it had a laser rangefinder detector because they were mounting new fancy laser-guided bombs under the wings. I'm trying to pinpoint with that. And to save weight, to make space and, availability for all the new heavy equipment, keep in mind this is late 60s electronics, they removed the guns. Maybe not the best decision in the world, but hey, 16 B-57Gs were stationed in Thailand by mid-1970, and they were to fly operations over Vietnam, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and other areas. And frankly, they didn't do all that great. The laser-guided munitions sometimes worked, sometimes didn't. The electronics were still pretty early, although not as bad as they would have been in like 65. But really the guns were missed, frankly. So it was really just discovered that just the good old-fashioned point and shoot was better. Mark I eyeball, maybe. So already by 1971, there was pressure to scale down, bring them home. And there was also some pressure to send more over, but this was resisted. And in 1972, the B-57Gs were sent home. So they were only in theater for not quite 2 years. I'm not going to say they didn't have some successes, but yeah, it was an interesting experiment. And there actually were plans to continue it with newer technology into the 1970s, but, post-war budget cuts by the mid-70s kind of axed the program. Plus, airframes were simply wearing out. They only had so many to to use up and what have you. So by the mid-70s, really you just see the Air National Guard flying certain variants, and NASA would end up having some of the RB-57Fs redesignated as WB-57Fs, and they would fly 3 of them well into the 21st century. The Air Guard would keep theirs, usually just for training and whatnot, until 1983, by which time just all the airframes were old and tuckered out. And one last mention. There was actually a foreign user of not just the Canberra, but the Martin B-57. Yeah, Pakistan. They would get a number of them and use them in combat twice. In 1965 and 1971 in the first and second, first and second, but the one and the other Indo-Pakistan War. There's been a lot of them over the years. And they too would use theirs as night and day bombers, really pinpointing airfields. They would also have some of the photo reconnaissance versions and whatnot. So, yeah, kind of interesting that Pakistan used it. So, even though it's a bit of a forgotten jet today, it made its mark on history. And it was definitely a part of Vietnam. It did more than it really gets credit for. And that's why I would really like to see Corgi do more American variations in the Canberra. And I think they have a good start here with their Aussie on that first video, and just based on other reactions online, people really like this Mark 20, B-20. But what do you think? Like I said, I tried to make it as brief as possible. Also, keep in mind, I'm just a hobbyist. I know this will shock you. I am not a pilot. So I'm sure I got some things wrong. But if this sparks your interest in history and learning, check it out for yourself. This really tickles me. The models are cool, but it's just a small 3D example. I do like Diecast for just the weightiness. Kind of fun. The crew inside on the Corgis. They're not removable like on a Hobby Master, but that's alright. The gear go up and down. Some like this one do have opening bomb bay, but others like this one in the electronic version, you obviously have a sealed over bay because why would it be opening? But I've had this one for a long time. Actually, I got this B-57A out of England years ago. I found a website that exported for a really good price, and they were out of print here for a long time. So it only ended up costing like $60 plus shipping. It's like 80, which is ironic because of the different economies. That's about what this costs now, or even a little more. But once upon a time, Corgis were quite affordable for the quality you got. They're not as nice as Hobby Masters, but what I do like about Corgi, they do a lot of aircraft, namely British, that Hobby Master just doesn't really do. Plus a lot of World War II stuff like the Defiant. So there you go, another aircraft video in the can, guys. Kind of like last time, if enough folks watch it, I will do a third one on the British Canberras. There are some variations and interesting histories there, although I do think the American and the Australians are maybe a little more colorful, just based on when and where they served. But what do you think? What is your favorite Canberra variation? Let's discuss below. This is Misha, and once again, I'm going to go have some dinner.